Welcome to this retrospective slash review for Divinity, the game I just recently completed playing. And let's go ahead and just get right on into the actual game itself, some of the high points and some of the low points. We'll just go ahead and say that for starters, you're going to get a lot of content out of this game, even if you just play through it one time. For me, I was recording my time, and I think it was about 59 hours, give or take, roughly. And that's for a fairly completionist run of the game. Basically, I did pretty much every quest that was to be done in the game, uh, killed as many creatures as I could come across. I don't think I left barely anything alive because I'm a bloodthirsty son of a gun that way. So it was it was very much focused that way. Even if you just kind of want to rush through the main game for the most part, you're still looking at roughly about 30 hours of playtime. So you're going to get a lot of playthrough out of the game. For the most part, it kind of had a feel of it that you wanted to keep coming back to it. It kind of would reel you back in, as it were. There are only a couple of points in the game, in the story wise, that were a bit of a lull, as it were, a slog. I felt like the Stormfist Castle section, that was kind of a bit of a low point where you're sitting down running these errands for the little kid. That was kind of a low point. Iona's dungeon, the Rivertown sewers, those were a bit of a slog as well. Um, and really the opening part of the game, when you're sitting there low level, it was very difficult. And that opening dungeon, the catacombs, was fairly lengthy. I don't think it was quite as massive as the other two I just mentioned, but it was fairly lengthy, and you had to be very cautious for sure. Um, but I will go ahead and say right now, it was challenging early on, but it wasn't frustrating. Would be the word I would say. So it was challenging, but it's something you could definitely get around dealing with. And the thing about the challenge aspect of the game is the game does stay challenging for the most part up until you get to about the upper portion of the level 30 or whatnot. And then the game starts to be a little easier because there's very few things that can actually harm you at that point. But the game does like to basically give you a false sense of security, as it were, and then surprise you with something really nasty. So that's something you got to keep in mind. And it did it to me many times where I was sitting there like, oh, I'm a badass. I can take anything, and then oh crap, what just happened? So it definitely is one of those games where it's decently challenging early on, but you get to a point where you're very powerful, and there's not much that can stop you. Now, if you're playing from a completionist standpoint, you'll get to the end of the game, and well, you saw the Lord of Lies, Demon of Lies, whatever. He was a punk, and I just kind of smacked him down. Um, but if you just kind of play mostly straight through, it would probably still be a bit of a challenge with him. But I'd say, yeah, story wise, pretty decent. I wouldn't say it was a great storyline. I would say it was a fairly decent storyline. There weren't any like real twists and turns. Um, there were some actually pretty humorous portions to the story. At least I thought there's some fairly funny parts to it, and I would say it was good, but it wasn't like a mind blowing story by any stretch of imagination. I think this was more about really the gameplay. And in some of the places I've seen, they've described this as a successor to Baldur's Gate. And I personally don't see that at all. I think this is more along the lines of Diablo, really. Uh, First of all, you don't have a party, it's just you and you alone. And about the only thing from Baldur's Gate I can see that this game has is the fact that you can pause the game with a space bar, which is a huge benefit to playing the game, and definitely something worth having. I love that spacebar feature, and then of course use the Alt key to actually highlight dropped loot. But speaking of loot, that's kind of two of my negative aspects of the game. First of all, the inventory system itself is a bit of a mess. It you just can you try to store things basically wherever you can, and dealing with the shopkeepers, they run out of money, and then you just kind of you're just storing stuff in barrels and whatnot, and it can get very messy and cluttery. So if you're a little OCD like me, that's just it drives you insane. And the actual store system itself, the it's more of like a bartering type system, which is kind of interesting, and it is kind of neat from a certain standpoint, but it's very cumbersome. And I understand they're probably doing that to make it more realistic towards like a medieval type period, but it is cumbersome. Um, Basically, I would have to take out my phone. I'd have to sit here and do some calculations. Say, okay, I traded them 20,000 gold worth of items. I'm trying to buy 36,173 uh, in gold from them. So I'd have to say, okay, I need to give them, you know, 16,173 or something. That was a fairly simple math calculation. So a lot of times it wasn't something very easy like that, and you'd have to break out your calculator or sit here and try to run math through your head. Not really fun doing it that way. Um, and you can also accidentally sell the equipment that you're wearing if you click on it wrong, which that's one thing you can notice when you're playing the game is if it's yellow, it's something you have equipped. So don't sell your equipped items in the game. Um, another thing about the equipment that I think is definitely lends it more to a Diablo type game rather than Baldur's Gate is the fact that the stats for everything in the game are completely and totally random. And a perfect example of that would be the dragon armor that I got. Supposedly this great legendary armor, and like the breastplate when I picked it up, it had an armor value of 190. It's absolute garbage. I mean, the dwarven armor I had picked up earlier in the game had 390, so it was a much higher armor value. And it was just that was the luck of the draw. Another one of the big lucks of the draw is I almost never got a freaking mace drop at all in the game. It took me forever to get an actual mace to drop in the game. It wasn't until like literally the very end area that someone finally dropped a higher rated mace that I could actually start using. So it's also the whole randomness is very, I don't know, it hurts the game to a certain extent if you're trying to build a specific type character. It almost seemed like the game was like, oh, you want to use maces? Well, I'm going to drop everything else. So it was just completely and totally unlucky on my part in that regards. But that is something to consider. So there is no consistent stats on the items, and then the types of items you may get may not be very consistent. Uh, to tell the difference between a one-handed and two-handed weapon, that's another thing the game doesn't do. Like the weapons themselves don't say this is a two-handed sword. Now, some of them, you know, if you know anything about medieval weaponry, you would know, okay, a claymore, obviously two-handed. But there are certain swords that like, oh, this looks like a good one-handed weapon. Nope, that's two-handed. And I do have a link here, not this one right here, and I'll put all these links in the description. But this website right here, I went specifically to find out which axes and swords and whatnot were one-handed and which were two-handed. So if you go down here, you'll see all the two-handed swords. So apparently there's a way to use a bastard sword one-handed. I couldn't figure out how to do it. But like here, the singing blade, it didn't really look like something that would be two-handed, but you found out either this way or just through trial and error, basically. If you're into using two-handed weapons, that's not a big deal. But if you're trying to do a sword and shield type character, it's a bit of a problem, I guess. Um, other than that, and the couple of areas in the game where it's slogged down, I'm trying to think, is there anything else negative I can think about the game? That's pretty much my big gripes as far as the game is concerned. Um, so anyway, as far as far as my actual score for the game, sticking to my standard GOG scoring, where we have a 5-star scale, I'd probably give this about 4.5 stars out of 5, or 90% basically. It's definitely a very fun game. It has huge replayability value. The fact that you have basically three classes, warrior, mage, and survivor, which is basically a thief, that gives you a huge replayability value, not only what type of weapons you use, but also the whole skill trees that are available to you. I would say, just from looking at it, probably the mage is almost like the one you'd want to put less points into, because you can usually buy a lot of books to get a lot of the mage skills. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but you can actually buy a lot of your stuff spells wise. Um, but the fact that you have access to all three skill trees at any one time is a huge benefit in the game. So you're not just stuck to, say, the warrior skills. In fact, it's highly recommended, depending on what class you're playing, that you get your restoration skill up. In fact, most restoration you can get for free, to be honest with you. So you only maybe need to put 1 point in restoration. But lock picking is a huge skill that you need to look into from the survivor skill set, because everybody needs lock picking really. And there's just some good skills here and there from different branches you use to build your character, so you're not stuck. And I think that's a great aspect to the game. And like I said, there's so many different ways of playing it as well. If you want to go more of a ranged type character, you can do that. And it's very flexible system, very fun to play, and it, for the most part, has that reel you back in. Let me play just a get through this area kind of aspect to it. So it definitely reels you in, very Diablo-esque in its play style, for all the benefits and negatives that brings with it. So good play. It's mostly about the gameplay. The story is pretty decent. It's really not the main aspect to it. It's more about the gameplay really. And I think it's definitely worth your time. Now, speaking of getting the game, I happen to have the GOG store up right now, this is where I bought it from. And this game, and I think pretty much almost everything in the series, is currently on sale right now. But the really early games like Divine Divinity right now, as you can see, are Black Friday sale for 59 cents. You also, on Steam, have the same sale going on Steam, and like 59 cents for just this game, or you can get the original three games, Beyond Divinity, Divine Divinity, and Divinity 2, for $2.99. And really, at that price right now, if you're considering this series, it's a steal to jump in. At least get the first three games for sure. Um, they have the other one down here, Divinity Original Sin 2 Eternal Edition, which has the original Sin games, but doesn't have the real-time strategy game, Dragon Commander, which is kind of interesting. Not quite as good of a deal, because you see it's only 45% off, so that may be something to consider. But yeah, Steam and GOG have this available. The other place I looked at for PC currently doesn't have it on sale. So the normal price is $5.99. Um, Basically, Humble Bundle does have it. I'm sure they probably have sales as well. I'm not actually very familiar with Humble Bundle, but I did look to see who else would have that. So if this is a storefront you like to use, then they also have it. Epic Game Store did not have it, and I'm not really sure if there's anybody else I could think of that could possibly have it, but these are the three stores that I did find it online. And yeah, like, it goes on sale for dirt cheap. Now, as far as the game needing a guide, I did use this guide right here on Game Banshee for a lot of my playthrough. I didn't rely on it to get through the majority of the game. Oh, look at this. I'm talking about Diablo 2 down here. Anyway, so I didn't rely on it like constantly. But did I have to reference it a lot? Yes, I did. Um, so would I say this is a game that requires a guide? To a certain extent, possibly. Probably about 15-20% of the game, you might have to you get stuck in a part, and you might want to come here and figure out what you need to do. There are certain quests and whatnot that you can break if you do things out of order. And so for me, I would usually look at these areas and just see, okay, what sort of quests are available. And then wouldn't really try to delve too deep into what the guy was saying about the quest, just saying who was offering the quest and seeing if I could figure it out. And for the most part, I would say I was able to figure most things out, but I did have to access the guide here and there. So I wouldn't say it's a guide heavy game, but it's probably a useful idea to have a guide available to you when you're playing through it. And I already mentioned here, if you're trying to get a little more idea of what type of weapons you want to use, this is a pretty decent website on Divinity Wiki. That's really the only thing I accessed on this website was how to get the which weapons did what, basically. And probably would have been a good idea to have this available early on in the game, but hindsight being 2020. I also went to this website here, and this one I kind of found really close to the end. And the only thing I really used on this website is down here when it talks about the game mechanics, talks about the different type of skills. So that's a pretty decent idea to give you some idea of what skills are worth doing. And I only came to this website because I was trying to figure out which of these new Path of the Divine skills would actually be worth putting points into. And obviously, Heaven's Blessing is at the very top there. So I can't really speak to the basic walkthrough here on the site. It looks like it's extremely well detailed, but I can't say that I used it per se. But I'll go ahead and link this one in the description as well, because this could be a very good resource for your own playthrough of Divine Divinity. And also, GameFAQs has some pretty decent guides. The food effects one, that was a great one I used just to figure out which food items did what for you. They healed you, they give you strength, they give you mana back. This is a good one. Character guide is also kind of like that other one I just told you, where it said which skills are useful. And also, like, if you go in here, it tells you where you can get free skills in certain points. Like, it tells you where you can get all the free points of restoration, which is really helpful. And it also kind of breaks down the differences between the warriors, survivors, and wizards, and how it affects certain aspects of the character. And those were the, and also this special armor holy artifacts fact. I think I referenced it maybe once. I didn't really reference it that much because it was also on the Game Banshee website. But this is another place you can go for good walkthrough advice, basically, on the game. So, and I also went ahead and talk about Linux performance. With Linux performance, using Wine, I think it started off with Wine 6.0, and eventually my Wine did get upgraded to 6.2. I didn't notice any difference between the two versions, really. It worked pretty much seamlessly. And the only thing that I would say that I noticed was that Direct 3D performance seemed to be a little spotty. But then again, people in a lot of these message boards and whatnot that I looked at online said the same thing about trying to run it on newer versions of Windows as well. And they would have like little DLLs. You put this in there, you can put it in software rendering, but you're still getting Direct 3D effects. I didn't want to sit around here and try playing with that aspect. So it's just kind of one of those weird games where running it in software rendering actually worked better than running it with actual hardware acceleration, which is a very odd occurrence. The other odd thing I would say is that the 3 cutscenes in the game are at extremely low resolution, a 640 by 480, which for something that came out in 2002 is just a very odd thing, at least as far as I'm concerned. And would it affect you playing it? Not really. It was more affected me because I was trying to record everything. That was my big issue with it. But it was just kind of two oddities there. But as far as running it on Linux, it worked absolutely perfectly. I use Mini Galaxy since I bought it on GOG, And the only issue I had there was with Mini Galaxy is it runs the first executable it sees in the directory. And so in this case, the control panel, it would run a control panel every single time I would try to run it. So what I did is I just cut that executable and put it in a different folder that I called backup. And then when I hit play, it would do div executable. So that's really not a Linux thing so much as a Mini Galaxy issue. But for the most part, if you're trying to run this on Linux, it runs flawlessly. And that's pretty much all I got to say about the game. I definitely highly recommend it. Like I said, 4.5 stars out of 5, or about a 90%, because it does have a few niggling small issues, as it were, but nothing that's so distracting from the game that you don't want to play it. In fact, this is one of those games that you could be drawn back in to play it again because it does have a huge replayability factor. I mean, I tried to play it mostly as a paladin type character, but you can also do things very differently in the game for sure. It basically does portend itself to basically very different play styles for sure. So anyway, thank you very much for watching this video and this review, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Take care.